I'm here at the Norris Dam Overlook with AGO camera person Simon Ballantoy. Perhaps an unusual location to introduce this program, but we're on our way to the Lenore Museum, which is just a bit downriver above the town of Norris. Here at the TVA Dam, the Norris Dam, a magnificent structure. I think its construction began around the early 30s. Maybe the first TVA undertaking of its type, I'm not sure. I'm reminded a little bit that the origin of the organ was originally the hydraulis, an instrument in which water power provided the wind pressure for a pipe-like instrument. And I think that even the etymology of the word hydraulis is interesting, simply because we have the prefix hydro for water and the aulos, A-U-L-O-S, which was a panpipe-like instrument or perhaps an oboe-like instrument. So it's interesting that the origin of the word even has ties to the organ. And there's some irony in that because I think the aulos was considered the secular ancient instrument when compared to the Apollonian lyre or stringed instrument, which was considered more sacred, the panpipe being considered the more profane part of the music spectrum, that we organists who play church instruments play instruments that were originally perhaps from the profane side of the spectrum. Anyway, this wonderful structure, I'm sure, could provide plenty of water pressure to even perhaps power the Atlantic City auditorium organ. Something tells me it wouldn't have any trouble doing that at all. Anyway, we are going to head just half a mile down this valley to meet Will Dunklin and the proprietor of the Lenore Museum, Michael Melkoda. And we will see you there. Simon and I are now at the Lenore Museum, just above Norris, where there is a one-of-a-kind instrument, a barrel organ from Germany that we think dates from the 1820s. And here also we have Will Dunklin and the curator of the museum, Michael Melkoda. And I would give the floor over to them now.
Good morning, Michael. Morning. Good to see you. Thank you for having us over at the museum today.
Thanks for coming.
Great. Tell us a little bit about the museum. Why is this museum here?
Okay, well, the Will G. and Helen Lenore Museum, we've been here since 1975. I am part of Norris Dam State Park. I've got about 5,000 different items on display. It was items that were collected by the husband and wife, and they lived here locally. They spent about 60 years collecting everything, and it was donated in the mid-70s. We've been open free of charge ever since then. I remember actually coming in here as a school kid on a field trip about this tall, looking at everything, and here I am running the place.
So is this museum mostly about the European settlers, or does it also include some of the native people artifacts?
It is incredibly varied. I tell people that come in, each case almost is something different. And you're exactly right. I mean, we have things from the settlement of early East Tennessee, 1770s, 1780s, and we also have Native American items that go back as much as 12,000 years. I've got some fossils that go back millions of years, so a little bit of everything.
So we do have one artifact in the museum that really stands out as a different character completely, don't we? We're going to talk about a little organ that lives here. Mm-hmm. How did that instrument come to be here?
Okay, well, the story of our barrel organ is that Mr. Lenore purchased it from a woman named Gaunt up in Bulls Gap, Tennessee. And again, like I was telling you about his methods of collecting, for a number of years, he was aware of the organ, but the man, Mr. Gaunt, was not interested in selling it. And once Mr. Gaunt passed away, Mrs. Gaunt, agreed to a sale, and that was in the early 80s.
1980s.
1980s, yes. And we know it's from Germany, but we don't really know the story of how it came across the Atlantic here. But we know that it was acquired in the early 80s from Bulls Gap.
Do we know if the Gaunt family that had the organ, if they were immigrants, were they first generation, or were they the children of immigrants?
That, I don't know. I mean, Gott, obviously a German name, and one of the Gotts, the grandson, was in here a few years ago. He always knew about the organ. He even gave me an old clip, a news clip about it. A man named Bert Vincent wrote a little column about it, probably 1940s, early 50s, black and white photo of our organ. But the Gott family really seemed to have no idea, of its origins before their family got it. So I don't think, what I'm saying is I don't think the Gotts were the ones that brought it here to America from Germany.
Okay. Let's go look at it.
Sure.
Here we are at the architectural marvel that is the Lenore Museum in Norris, Tennessee. The building itself designed by Knoxville architect Bruce McCarty. And speaking of architects and organs, you'll remember the famous architect Christopher Wren, who designed St. Paul's Cathedral in London, England. Christopher Wren famously called the great organ at the cathedral that damn box of whistles. So now, ladies and gentlemen, here is the Norris damn box of whistles. So this doesn't look like any organ I've ever seen before. Maybe at a fairgrounds, but usually even a fairground organ seems to have some exposed pipes. I don't see any pipes. Is this an organ?
It is an organ. It's what's known as a barrel organ. It's completely mechanical. All that I have to do, and I'm not an organist, is there's a little crank here on the side. As long as I turn it clockwise like this, everything that needs to be done, that's supposed to be done, is done via the crank.
So obviously this did not come from the Shantz Organ Company in Orrville, Ohio. How old is this thing, and what is its history?
Okay, well, for a long time, and I think earlier in the segment we talked about the 1820s, and we get that date because down in the bowels of this thing, long ago when they were taking it apart, you have to understand it was a box of parts when we got it, it wasn't functioning. There were some old German newspapers that were dated, mid-1820s. And then also from the clothing and the uniforms of the soldiers, we figure that was the time period, 1820s.
The 1820s. So a little bit of research on my part has revealed the name Ignaz Bruder. Is it possible that this was built by Ignaz Bruder?
Very possible. In fact, for many years that was the big mystery. We knew Germany, we knew a date, but we didn't know the builder. And for many years here, the park manager that was here for well over 20 years, this was his baby. And he was the only one that cranked it. I knew some basic facts and can tell people about it. But when he retired about 2 years ago, suddenly the keys were literally passed to me, and I had to develop a program. And I came across the name Bruder. And specifically, a little town in the southwest corner of Germany near Switzerland and the French border called Waldkirch, which has a whole history of several centuries of making mechanical organs such as this.
And, as you say, it's near the Swiss border, which the Swiss were famous for building music boxes using the same similar barrel technology to play little metal harps. And having now looked inside here, there's definitely a relationship between the Swiss and the German construction on this. So you said crank. There's a crank over here. Point out the crank, and what else are we looking at on the side?
Okay.
It looks like no organ I've ever seen.
Right, and just I'm not an engineer, I will say that, okay? I'm a historian. But yes, this is the crank right here. And you can see our very high-tech way that we have to attach it here. Just a nice little It looks almost like a heavy paper clip there that holds it in place. But all that I have to do is crank it clockwise like this, and all the gears that you see here just take care of all the animation of the 4 levels as well as playing the tunes. And it plays anywhere from 10 to 12 tunes.
Okay. Now, as you said, it is cranked and many things happen, and it does not look familiar as an organ at first. But if we look closer, we can see here 5 sliders. They're very small, but it is indeed just like a tracker organ wind chest. And on top are some of the wooden pipes, just visible. A couple of open pipes, which to some organists would be familiar as melodia pipes. And then a stopped wooden pipe like a stopped diapason or a gaject. How many pipes do we think are in the organ?
Anywhere from 130 to 140.
130, 140, but they're very small and they're all wooden. For our organists, we have discovered there are 5 ranks in this organ. It is all wooden pipes. They are all open pipes except for the lowest octave of the 8-foot stop. The ranks are an 8-foot, a 4, a 2 2/3, a 2, and a 1 1/3. It seems to be in the key of A. So the lowest note is the A below middle C. And those are the stop pipes. So physically, the longest pipe is about 1 foot long. And then the rest of the pipes get to be very, very small indeed. We've set it up now just to hear the 8-foot rank playing one of the tunes. And Michael, why don't you give it a crank? Let's hear it.
All right.
So, Michael, for us organists, when we say it's an 8-foot stop, that means it's the same pitch as the piano.
Okay.
Then the name 4-foot stop, 2 2/3, it's adding octaves above that sound, as if you were having someone else playing on the extra keys.
Okay.
Now, this organ was not rebuilt by an organ builder, and his skills in tuning were modest, to say the least. So we're going to hear the same tune now with all 5 stops on, and you'll definitely hear a difference in volume and color. So we will add the 4, 2 2/3, 2, and 1 1/3. Let's hear it now. We're back looking at the front of the organ now, where there are 4 levels of animated characters. There is a woodland scene at the bottom. There's a ballroom in the middle, and there is a Prussian military parade in the top, and there is a clown, an acrobat, doing gymnastics at the very top. Our clown has come undone from his mechanism, so he's being still these days. But let's go to another tune now. and get some close-ups of the dancers and the workers and the military. We're now listening to the 4-foot stop by itself on the organ. Oh, we have a cipher. We're zoomed in very close. This is the treble side of the barrel, and this one stop knob, if you will, is what changes the songs. You'll see that it is scored with what look like the threads of a screw. It actually moves 1/16 of an inch, and that is what changes the song. Simply by moving it, lifting the catch, pulling it out, and setting it down again, we're on a different song.
Okay.
Are you filming? So we're looking at the side of the instrument. It appears that the original sides of the instrument are missing. They would have had a decorative cover on them at some point. However, with the side gone, we can see 3 of the ranks of pipes here. You can see the ends of it. And then there are a couple of pipes, organ pipes, that are laying horizontally here, and you will see organ pipes hidden at the bottom. But the real heart of the instrument is its barrel, which basically looks like a very large rolling pin with tiny brass tacks sticking out of it. What happens is, as the barrel goes around, tiny little picks are lifted by the individual brass pins, and that is the same as playing a key on a modern instrument. Michael, let's hear another tune.
Okay.
Now, doesn't that make you want to put on your lederhosen and get a beer stein and just dance around the living room? Michael, tell us about the men that rebuilt this little instrument.
Okay, we talked a little bit about how we don't know how it came from Germany. We know how it originated. Mr. Lenore bought it up in Bull's Gap, but the really local connection here, we have to mention Mr. Reg Lovell and Mr. Paul Evans. They were 2 literal neighbors in the town of Norris. They lived not next door to each other, but from what I understand, across the street. And they spent about 500 man-hours putting this thing back together. I mean, there were a number of pieces missing. There were a number of pieces and parts that needed to be made. Mr. Lovell, who was our longtime caretaker for this machine, was a machinist out at Y12 for many years, so he knew what he's doing, and Mr. Evans was a bit of a tinkerer as well. He was a TVA employee. So again, about 500 hours of time to put it back together to get it in working order. Also, we must mention Mr. Joe Deal of Knoxville. Mr. Deal has a number of items here, wood carved items on display here, but he and his wife, I don't know if you guys can see this, but a number of the pieces were broken, and he carved, for example, a lot of the horse legs and hooves here that needed to be replaced on our soldiers, and his wife painted them back. So we have to credit Mr. Deal as well, along with Paul Evans and Reg Lovell, for getting this thing back in working order in the early 80s.
Now, one of these gentlemen actually did work on clocks. Is that
yes, that would be Mr. Evans, was a clock repairman.
And that does lead us back into music, because there are three famous Mozart pieces that we have that are attributed to a clockwork organ. And that doesn't mean that on the hour the organ played. It meant it was an instrument similar to this. An instrument that had gears and cranks and mechanical parts like a clock, probably the same technology as a clock, but it wasn't something that struck the hour. And this is a good example, and it's close to what we're going to see in East Tennessee as what Mozart wrote his famous F minor, toccatas, Fantasia, the F minor Fantasia. Thank you, Michael, very much. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Well, thank you guys for coming out and kind of discovering the barrel organ and your interest in it. Again, we're here at the Lenore Museum out at North Stam State Park.
Simon and I are now at the home of Brad and Lois Rule, and Brad is the owner of two different reed organs. We are in his living room now, where he is seated at what he calls the parlor organ. Brad, why don't you tell us, how did you come to be in possession of this instrument?
A serendipitous death, I suppose. My Aunt Bertha died in Blount County, lived in a house with no electricity, and had her own well outside the back door, and she always had this pump organ that I coveted. I'm not sure why, but as a child I always wanted it. So when she passed away and I was 13, we got the pump organ, and my dad helped me rebuild it, and that set me on the course. I was cursed from then on to be interested in organs, I suppose. So that's how I came by it. Well, once I had it, I had to learn to play it, and by good fortune, the reed organ came with MacArthur's new method for the reed organ, which has scarred me forever, because it had technique in it in which the thumb was labeled as X, and the forefinger was number 1, and the pinky finger was number 4. And so I started to learn to teach myself to play the organ from that book. And then when I showed up to take organ lessons from John Brock a few years later, he was very charitable about that, but made it clear that I had to learn to finger my music properly. And sometimes I still mess up and think that this is finger number 4, so unfortunately it has affected me. But
Was that fingering system unique to the MacArthur method, do you think, or was that typical of reed organ technique?
John told me at the time that old 19th century books, even piano books, sometimes used that system. So I guess it was just like shape notes were common and people knew them and no one can read them anymore. And back then, I suppose, I wonder if it was like a language and people could go back and forth between one system and the other seamlessly between fingerings and not have it confuse them.
That could be. So this was the first instrument at which you started practicing the organ, no?
Unfortunately, unfortunately, yes, because reed organs don't demand great technique. They're slow of speech and not an instrument that was ever designed to play great literature. But that's what I had. That's what I started with. So.
Now, this is being described as a reed organ. We sometimes hear about harmoniums, reed organs, sometimes even sophisticated things like vocalions, orchestrions, and so on and so forth. What exactly is a reed organ, at least in America, most typically?
Well, in Europe, reed organs were called harmoniums and they worked on pressure. And the big difference with American reed organs is they work on suction. And the reason for that is that it's easy to build an instrument that uses suction. It's cheaper to build because a reservoir that holds suction can be much more lightly built than a reservoir that's designed to hold pressure without exploding. So that was part of the reason they could crank them out in a factory and people could afford to buy them. And they were very compact. And so there were a lot of things going for them as far as making them affordable to American homes. So here you can see a little bit about how they work, and whereas pipe organs have small shades, reed organs have these little flaps they call forte flaps. So if you play a chord, you get some control of the dynamics. Opening and closing the forte flap. So they are instruments of limited dynamics, but
So all of the sound is essentially coming out of this little area beneath the keyboard or through perhaps the keyboard itself.
Don't forget the reeds are all mounted on a wooden soundboard, which is as deep as the reed organ, as wide as the reed organ. So it's a spruce soundboard that does resonate with, and that helps to mellow out that brassy tone again. So in that respect, European harmoniums are brasher and louder because they work on pressure. And the reeds have no resonating, really. There's no little wooden cell to slide the reed into. It's just, on a harmonium, the tongue is just riveted into a brass plate, and the brass plate is screwed inside the organ, and the sound just comes directly out. So harmoniums are louder and a little brasher, but of course they're, in Europe they're generally filling bigger rooms too.
And you can control volume a little bit through tempo of the actual pumping,
yes,
correct?
there is some expression to be gained. So, for instance, you can get quite a bit of crescendo just by increasing the pressure by pumping harder. You can let the wind die back. See, it's quite a bit softer as the wind pressure drops. Crescendo again, and then of course you can add the forte flap.
So the stop list of this instrument, would that be typical of what an organ of this size or displacement would offer? What do we have here exactly?
There's probably no logic at all to stop names on reed organs, but generally flute, and this goes back to 19th century, early 19th and 18th century organs. On English organs, if there was a stop just called flute, it was always a 4-foot stop. And if early organs in New England that we've restored, it would often just say flute, and it would be the 4-foot stop on the grate. And often on those early organs, it would be a tenor C 4-foot stop, which is rather odd. But so that carried through. So here we have flute, well, that's the 4-foot stop in the treble, above middle C. And then, for some reason, the 8-foot stop is called the dulciana. Well, on a pipe organ, the dulciana is always an 8-foot stop, so there is some logic there. And by the same token, in the bass, below middle C, we get the bass to the dulciana. It's called the diapason, which again, on a pipe organ, is always generally an 8-foot stop. So logic does apply, but then the 4-foot stop in the bass is called principal. So it begins to break down a little bit. You have softer versions of the dulciana and the diapason that are just called dulcet. You have the dulcet bass and the dulcet treble, which are hardly different at all from.
I'm not sure a difference there.
It's not. There's very little difference. It shows up more in the extremes, in the extreme treble and bass.
What's not to like about that? That
That is a-
evokes a smile on everybody's
That
face.
is a pure parlor entertainment.
It's a good piece of music, I think. There must thus have been repertoire being composed for these instruments, if indeed they were in so many American living rooms, no?
You know, most of the repertoire is transcriptions. This was probably written for a military band.
Okay.
And, you know, that the MacArthur's method for the reed organ over there, most of that music is transcriptions from little operettas or from, you know, brass band music. And some of it is, you know, like we have the Robert Schumann Traumerei, and as I have said, playing Traumerei on the reed organ puts the trauma in Traumerei, because hearing it on the reed organ is a little bit eye-opening. I mean,
Ooh, the scenes from childhood of Schumann, can you play Traumerei for us? We would love to hear it.
I guess you have to buckle your seatbelts for the awesome tone that it will produce for this.
That's lovely. You know, I'm actually struck by a few things. First of all, the speed of that tremolo, that is quite the hummingbird.
We, in fact, have a native-born writer of a novelty piece for the reed organ. And for those who have grown up around here, you probably have heard of the Newmarket train wreck. And there is, in fact, a piece inscribed to the Robertson's Creek Male Quartet League that sings in very doleful fashion about the Newmarket train wreck in 6 very sad verses. But, as a prelude to that, there's an entire sheet of instructions about how to reenact the sounds of the Newmarket wreck on the pump organ.
Oh my gosh, utilizing the mechanics of the instrument
All the myriad
evoke?
myriad sound effects that we've found that reed organs are capable of.
Oh wow, this is going to be great.
So,
So the Newmarket train wreck, Newmarket is exactly where your shop
Right.
is. This is on 11E.
yes,
And this was in what? The beginning, the aughts,
1904.
04. What happened?
Well, Southern Railway had a wreck, as the old song starts. And even today, it's the worst wreck Southern ever had. It killed, I think, 70 people or so. And what they had done, as I have had explained to me, is they had, and I've never had it corroborated that they actually violated the safety standards of the day, but they had like lumber cars, and then a passenger car, and then a car filled with some other kind of freight, and then a passenger car. So when it crashed, you had all this lumber crashing into, passenger compartments, and so it was a terrible wreck. And Southern Railway spent an enormous amount of money buying up all the newspapers that reported on the wreck, so it's difficult to find a contemporary account of that wreck, because Southern, they really did, they just bought it all up.
And this is the very same track line
Right,
that
it's the
exists
same
today.
track line that exists today.
Oh gosh. So this piece of music, you must have the score for it.
We have the score, although all we have here is the instructions. It says, directions for imitating the running of the trains, whistling, and explosion of the wreck before playing the song entitled The Newmarket Wreck by R.H. Brooks, Whitesburg, Tennessee. So we could call this a program piece, as it describes something that is not expressly musical, but it uses a musical instrument to do it.
Well, I would love to hear these special effects because one wouldn't assume that anything like that could be done on an instrument like this.
Well, perhaps it can't.
I'm seeing a spoon on your instrument. Is that by chance going to be used for this?
Alas, yes, the spoon is useful for bringing out the sound effects of the nearing the crisis point when the train's actually hit. The spoon is actually handy. Suitably impressed?
I really do think that's really something, knowing not only that that took place, but took place here locally. And we're given to understand that there is a choral piece of music, right? Didn't you mention this for male quartet?
It was.
And this piece of music is best performed today by an SATB quartet, correct?
Well, it seems to be because it's written, on treble and bass clef the way a normal hymn would be. And unless it was common, I don't know the history of male quartet leagues. It was the Robertson's Creek Male Quartet League. And whether or not they had high tenors that just sang up in that range as it's written, I'm not sure, but you're right. These days, an SATB group would find it easier to read.
And because you did have the score for that, we did make a recording of it, which we will allow everybody to hear now. So we're now in Brad and Lois's basement, where there is a larger reed organ. Brad, tell us what we are looking at here.
Well, this was an ST. It's very similar to what they call the Liszt model, which Franz Liszt actually played and approved of. But this is not the Liszt model. It's similar stop Liszt. And it's built for a church. Instead of the reed organ, the parlor organ that we see elsewhere in the tape that we've made, this one has 10 ranks of reeds. And the pedal reeds are quite large in size. So it gives an underpinning of bass that you can't get on your normal reed organ. And it has more colors. It has a celeste, and it has an oboe, and a, quote, trumpet, and a dulciana. And the colors are noticeably different, unlike the parlor organ upstairs, which is basically soft and loud. So these organs are capable of playing, Vierne and Langlais and some other Lefebvre-Bailey literature written for the harmonium, because they speak a little more quickly than a parlor organ, and they're a little more brash, and so they work better for what we think of as real, quote, real organ music, at least organ music written for the harmonium by composers like Franck, Vierne. So, what are you going to play, Jim?
Well, one of the famous cycles for the harmonium is the Léon Boelmann L'heure mystique, the mystical hours. I thought we might just play one short snippet of a piece out of here, just to hear what this instrument sounds like. And we have to play this organ like a bicycle because of the disposition. My feet are kind of behind me, and I feel like I'm way up here.
Yes, the pedals are, of course, they give us 1933, the AGO standards, place the pedal board farther in, which was easy to do with electric action, but here we have 4 feeder bellows and a bellows and all the reeds, all the mechanism in here. So there simply isn't room to put the pedal board farther in. So you are playing, as Jim says, it's kind of like riding an old bicycle, and your body is rather far forward and the pedals are back underneath you. In that sense, it's like playing an old North German Baroque organ, because those pedal boards are also very far back underneath you. So again, we're back into the authentic instrument territory.
And so on and so forth. A lot of these Boelmann pieces seem very homophonic, but there is some very strong examples of counterpoint, 3-part and 4-part, even Fugetta through here. This piece is an example, though, of, I think, a little bit of declaimed recitative. It even appears in octaves, which reminds me a little bit of Lefebvre-Velli's music, because sometimes he has things in octaves. I didn't use the pedal in this, but like a piece that I have sometimes played in the summertime at church. I don't know if you all know the Bolero. Bolero de Concert has some writing, which makes me think it would be much easier to just play it with the foot.
Yes.
So do you think we would have permission to do that?
I think we have permission
I'm not going to play the whole
from
thing.
the reed organ gods.
But just to give you an
So
idea.
is this all going to be on the
Do
grade?
you have something a little fiery?
fire. Yeah,
She's
sure.
so And then there's a recapitulation. I think this kind of captures the fiery spirit of this Spanish bolero. It's got an ending straight out of Isaac Albéniz, you know?
Very fun.
I think a lot of us, when we hear about harmoniums, think immediately of the Vierne pieces in free
Yes, of
style,
course.
right? As maybe the most famous things.
They seem to be the most carefully crafted.
Yeah, they're really quite beautiful music. Like the lead, is it possible to declaim a left-hand melody with a cello sound over just an undulating right hand effectively on this very nice instrument?
Try it.
very successful.
Yeah, it's
Very,
lovely.
very beautiful.
Wonderful. Beautiful.
It's pretty.
It's pretty heavy.
It's heavy and also just it's like mired in mud.
Yes.
Anyway, well, this is a delightful instrument, Brad. Great fun to play. It's nice for us to get to see your instruments, since it would be so hard for these to travel.
Well,
you
this
know.
one in particular.
For us to be able to come to them virtually, I think that makes for a really nice presentation in this instance.
Well, it's, you know, something you need to hear once in a lifetime and maybe not ever again.
Oh, listen to you. Hey, you know, there's
The reed
such
organs.
a rich tradition. I imagine this is all represented very well at OHS conventions and all of that sort of thing.
There are a lot of course, you know, there's a Reed Organ Society, and they have their own conventions.
Well, thank you for having us. This has been a delight,
It
and I
has
think
been
a great
a lot of
way
fun.
to finish up our 2021 program year. We appreciate your having us out to your home very, very much.
I'm glad to have you.
And thank you, Simon.